We need to be practical about seating arrangements, James. Rebecca simply isn't family enough yet to be at the main table. The words slithered through the crack in the doorway where I stood frozen, a tray of homemade appetizers cooling in my hands. I'd volunteered to help with the Thanksgiving dinner preparations at the Taylor family home, eager to make a good impression before our spring wedding. Mom, that's ridiculous. Rebecca is going to be my wife in 4 months, James protested, though his voice lacked the indignation I desperately wanted to hear. A fiancé isn't the same as family, darling. The main table is for Taylors by blood or long-standing marriage. We have traditions to uphold. Victoria Taylor's voice carried the serene confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Eleanor has been married to your brother for 5 years and given us 2 grandchildren. That's family. Rebecca is still provisional. I backed away silently, depositing the untouched appetizers on a side table before slipping into the powder room. My reflection stared back, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and eyes bright with unshed tears. Provisional. The word burned like acid. After 2 years together and an 8-month engagement, I was still an outsider testing for admission into the illustrious Taylor family. When I emerged, I smiled brightly at Great Aunt Meredith, who was passing in the hallway. The matriarch of the Taylor clan, she was the only family member who seemed genuinely pleased by my engagement to James. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her perceptive eyes noting my too straight posture, my too wide smile. Of course, I lied, the first of many such lies I would tell that day. Just a bit overwhelmed by all the preparations. She patted my arm gently. Victoria can be intense about family gatherings. Don't take it personally. But how could I not take it personally when Victoria's dismissal of me was so specifically, surgically personal? There you are. James found me moments later, his handsome face creased with mild concern. Mom was asking where the stuffed mushrooms went. On the sideboard, I answered, searching his face for any sign that he recognized the cruelty of his mother's words, any indication he'd defended me after I'd walked away. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing my too bright smile. "Fine," I lied, another brick added to the wall I was unconsciously beginning to build between us. "Just nervous about making a good impression." He squeezed my shoulder affectionately. "Don't worry so much. Mom's just particular about her holiday traditions. She'll warm up once we're actually married." That evening, I maintained perfect poise through dinner, where I was indeed seated at the secondary table with distant cousins and their +1s, while James sat at the main table with his parents, siblings, and Eleanor, the daughter-in-law who had successfully completed her transition from provisional to family. I laughed at appropriate moments, complimented Victoria's heirloom china, and ignored the pitying glances from those who understood exactly what my seating assignment signified. Frank's wife Eleanor sat stiffly at the main table, her posture betraying discomfort despite her privileged position. Several times during dinner, I caught her watching me with an unreadable expression, somewhere between sympathy and warning. When dessert was served, she briefly touched my arm while reaching for the cream. "You have beautiful taste," she commented quietly, fingering the vintage-inspired engagement ring on my left hand. "Did you choose it together?" "Yes," I answered, surprised by the personal question. "We found it at an estate sale in Vermont." Something like nostalgia flickered across her face. "How wonderful to make decisions together. Hold on to that." Before I could ask what she meant, Victoria's voice sliced through our exchange. "Eleanor, dear, Frank is telling us about the children's school play. Do pay attention." On the drive home to our apartment, I finally broke the silence. "Your mother doesn't think I'm family." James sighed, eyes fixed on the road. "She's from a different generation, Becca. Family means something specific to her. It's not personal." Being told I'm not family enough to sit with my future husband at Thanksgiving felt extremely personal, I countered, my voice steady despite the hurt churning beneath. "It's just seating arrangements," he said. reaching for my hand across the console. Once we're married, everything changes. You'll see. I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that a wedding certificate would magically transform me from unwelcome outsider to beloved family member. But as months passed and wedding planning intensified, Victoria's subtle undermining continued. She questioned every decision, from my choice of venue, wouldn't the Taylor family church be more appropriate, to the guest list, do we really need to invite all your college friends when space is limited? Each suggestion carried the same message. This wasn't truly my wedding. It was a Taylor family event that happened to include me. My sister can't come to the cake tasting, Victoria announced one February afternoon, sweeping into our apartment unannounced, using the emergency key James had given her without consulting me. But I've rescheduled it for Thursday at 3. I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been finishing an important work presentation. Thursday won't work. I have a client meeting I can't reschedule. Victoria's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched in surprise. Surely your little marketing projects can wait. This is your wedding cake. My little marketing projects pay our rent, I reminded her, keeping my tone deliberately light. And we already confirmed Saturday with the bakery. I've changed it, she insisted, placing a monogrammed leather planner on our coffee table with a definitive thud. Thursday works better for everyone else. Not for me, I maintained, meeting her gaze directly. And since I'm the bride, I think my schedule matters. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Weddings are family affairs, Rebecca. Many people's schedules need consideration. I assumed you'd be more flexible. After she left, I called the bakery to confirm our original Saturday appointment, only to discover Victoria had indeed changed it and paid a non-refundable deposit for the new time slot. When James returned home that evening, I recounted the incident, expecting his support. Instead, he shrugged. So we'll go to the tasting on Thursday. What's the big deal? The big deal is that I have a work commitment, I explained, frustration building. And your mother went behind my back to change plans we'd already made. She's just trying to help, he defended. You're always saying you're overwhelmed with planning. This is her way of taking some burden off your shoulders. By making decisions without consulting me? That's not help, James. That's control. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now recognized as a sign he was avoiding confrontation. Can't you just reschedule your meeting? For the sake of family harmony? Family harmony. The phrase revealed everything about our fundamental disconnect. To James, family harmony meant everyone accommodating Victoria's wishes. To me, it meant mutual respect and consideration, qualities his mother had never extended to me. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine appointment with a caterer. Victoria had insisted on accompanying us, positioning her involvement as helpful guidance rather than the interference it truly was. Now for the seating chart, the caterer said, spreading out a diagram of the reception hall. We'll need to finalize the head table arrangements. Before I could speak, Victoria leaned forward. The head table will seat the parents of the bride and groom, James and his best man, and, of course, Frank and Eleanor as the senior married couple in the family. I blinked in confusion. What about me? It's my wedding. Victoria patted my hand with condescending gentleness. Darling, the bride traditionally sits with her parents at a separate small table. It's more elegant that way. That's not traditional at all, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's how we've done Taylor weddings for generations, she replied with finality, turning back to the caterer. Now, about the menu selections. I looked to James, waiting for him to correct this absurdity, to point out that separating us at our own wedding reception was unthinkable. He shifted uncomfortably, then said, maybe we should discuss this privately before deciding. Not a refusal. Not a defense. Just another postponement of the confrontation he seemed determined to avoid at all costs. I excused myself to the restroom, hands trembling with suppressed rage and humiliation. In the pristine beige stall of the catering hall's restroom, I finally allowed myself to cry, silent tears of frustration streaking my carefully applied makeup. I'd spent months compromising on the wedding venue Victoria's choice, the color scheme Victoria's preference, even my bridesmaids, two of whom were James's cousins I barely knew, included at Victoria's insistence. But this being separated from James at our own reception was a bridge too far. It wasn't just about seating arrangements. It was about Victoria's determination to isolate me, to reinforce my status as an outsider even on the day that should symbolize my official entry into the family. When I returned to the table, the caterer was reviewing menu options, the seating chart temporarily set aside. Victoria was expounding on the superiority of filet mignon over salmon while James nodded absently. Neither acknowledged my return. That night in our apartment, the argument finally erupted. Your mother wants to separate us at our own wedding reception, and you couldn't even tell her no. I paced our small living room, all pretense of calm abandoned. I didn't agree to it, James protested. I just didn't want to fight about it in front of the caterer. When do you want to fight about it, James? Because in 4 years of knowing your mother, I've never once seen you stand up to her. Not once. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. You don't understand what she's like when she's upset. The silent treatments, the guilt trips that last for months. It's easier to just what? Let her control our lives? Let her treat me like an unwanted accessory to her perfect family picture. I stopped pacing to face him directly. If you can't set boundaries with her now, before we're married, it's never going to happen. She'll come around after the wedding, he insisted, repeating the same hollow promise he'd been making since Thanksgiving. Once it's official, she'll have to accept you. I stared at him, truly seeing for the first time how deeply entrenched he was in his mother's manipulations, how completely he believed that appeasement was the only option. Your mother told me I'm provisional family. Do you agree with her? He hesitated a second too long before answering. Of course not. But the wedding will change everything. A wedding doesn't make a family, James. Respect does. Support does. Standing together against anyone who tries to come between you does. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the question I never thought I'd ask. Do you even want to marry me, or are you just going through with it because it's scheduled and paid for? That's not fair, he said, reaching for me. I love you. You know I do. I stepped back, avoiding his touch. Love isn't enough if you can't be a partner. If you can't prioritize our relationship above your mother's approval. You're asking me to choose between you, he said, his expression hardening. No, I'm asking you to choose us our relationship, our future family over her control. There's a difference. James paced the apartment now, agitation visible in every movement. You just don't understand our family dynamic. My father was very strict, very traditional. Mom had to fight for every bit of influence she has. It made her protective of family traditions. Protective or controlling? I challenged. Because from where I stand, it looks like she's deliberately trying to exclude me from this family. She's trying to maintain standards. James's voice rose unexpectedly. You've always been so casual about everything, so quick to dismiss what matters to us. Maybe if you tried harder to fit in. The words hung in the air between us, revealing a truth I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to face. Deep down, James agreed with his mother. I wasn't quite good enough. Not quite Taylor material. I've done nothing but try to fit in since the day we got engaged, I said quietly. I've changed my hair, my clothes, even some of my opinions to be more acceptable to your family. But it's never enough, is it? Because the problem isn't what I do or don't do. It's that I'm not who your mother would have chosen for you. James looked away, unable to meet my eyes. That's not true. Then tell me right now that you'll insist we sit together at our wedding reception. Tell me you'll stand with me against your mother's interference. His continued silence was the only answer I needed. We spent that night in strained silence, the argument unresolved, but the fractures in our relationship now impossible to ignore. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent hours walking through the city park, examining our relationship from every angle, facing hard truths I'd been avoiding for months. James was a good man in many ways, kind, intelligent, hardworking. But he was also irreparably entangled in his mother's web of emotional manipulation, unable or unwilling to establish the boundaries necessary for a healthy marriage. I had been so focused on proving myself worthy to Victoria that I hadn't questioned whether the relationship itself was worthy of my investment. When I returned to our apartment that evening, my decision was made. "I can't marry you," I said simply as James looked up from his laptop. "Not because I don't love you, but because I can't spend my life fighting for basic respect from your family." His face crumpled. "Please, let's just talk about this. We can postpone the wedding, get some counseling, figure things out." Would your mother respect that decision? Or would she see it as confirmation that I was never right for you in the first place? I asked gently. His silence was answer enough. Ending an engagement is like dismantling a building you've spent years constructing. There are the practical concerns: returning the ring, canceling vendors, reclaiming deposits when possible. Then there are the emotional elements: explaining to bewildered friends and family, returning gifts, preparing responses to inevitable questions. But the hardest part is extracting yourself from the future you'd imagined. Each morning I woke up and remembered all over again that the life I'd planned no longer existed. No spring wedding at Orchid Hall. No honeymoon in Greece. No built-in family to supplement my own small one. James alternated between desperate attempts to change my mind and cold anger that I would throw away our relationship over family politics. His inability to see the situation clearly only confirmed I'd made the right decision, painful as it was. I moved into a friend's spare bedroom while looking for a place of my own. My parents, supportive but geographically distant, offered to help me relocate closer to them. "You could make a fresh start," my mother suggested during one of our daily phone calls. But something in me resisted running away. I'd built a life in this city, a career I loved, friends who understood me, favorite cafes and bookstores and running trails. Why should I be the one to leave? Victoria's response was predictably self-serving. According to mutual friends, she was telling everyone who would listen that she'd always known it wouldn't work out, and how fortunate it was that true colors were revealed before vows were exchanged. Her rewriting of history might have broken me completely if not for an unexpected ally in James's sister-in-law, Eleanor, the very woman Victoria had held up as the model of family integration. She did the same thing to me, Eleanor confessed over coffee, 2 weeks after the breakup. The separate seating, the provisional status, all of it. The only difference is that Frank stood up to her, repeatedly and publicly, until she had no choice but to accept me. I stirred my latte, processing this revelation. James kept saying she'd accept me after the wedding. Eleanor shook her head. Without him establishing boundaries, nothing would have changed. "You'd have spent years trying to earn a place at that table. How have you managed for 10 years? I asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor's laugh held a bitter edge. "Therapy. Lots of therapy. And maintaining enough distance to preserve my sanity." She hesitated before adding, "Frank and I are actually thinking about moving away. 10 years of Victoria's interference is enough." Her words were simultaneously validating and sobering. I had escaped a lifetime of exactly what Eleanor described: a perpetual quest for approval that would never be granted, with a husband who couldn't or wouldn't shield me from his mother's manipulations. As Eleanor prepared to leave, she hugged me unexpectedly. "I admire your courage," she whispered. "I wish I'd had the strength to draw those boundaries earlier." Those words sustained me through the difficult months that followed. Each time doubt crept in during sleepless nights or when mutual friends reported James was dating someone new, a woman Victoria reportedly adored, I reminded myself that ending the engagement hadn't been weakness, but strength. Not failure, but self-preservation. 6 months later, I had rebuilt my life piece by piece. New apartment in a vibrant neighborhood I'd always loved, but James had found too eclectic. Promotion at work, where I'd channeled my emotional energy into creative projects that impressed senior management. Tentative steps back into dating, though I approached each new connection with hard-earned caution. I had just returned from a promising third date with Alex, a landscape architect with kind eyes and refreshingly straightforward communication style, when my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Are you sitting down? Frank and I are hosting a vow renewal for our 10th anniversary next month. Casual garden party, very limited guest list that does not include Victoria. Would love for you to come." I smiled at the unexpected invitation, touched by the gesture of inclusion. Then a second text arrived. "It's at the Sunset Gardens venue, right next door to where your wedding was supposed to be. Totally coincidental when we booked it, but now seems like poetic justice. Say you'll come." An idea sparked irrational, extravagant, but suddenly irresistible. I'd received a substantial bonus that quarter and had been planning to invest it sensibly. But perhaps there was value in a different kind of investment. "I'll be there," I replied. "And I might have a suggestion to make the day even more memorable." The manager of Orchid Hall, the venue Victoria had insisted was the only appropriate location for a Taylor family wedding, was perplexed by my request, but ultimately accommodating once I explained I wanted to book the space for a charity fundraiser on the same day as the neighboring event. "We don't typically host competing events," she explained, "but since Sunset Gardens is a separate property and your event is for charity, we can make an exception." She gave me a curious look. "Weren't you supposed to have your wedding here last spring? With the Taylor family?" "Plans change," I said simply. "Sometimes for the better." I spent the next weeks coordinating with local women's shelters to organize a fundraising luncheon focusing on financial independence and healthy relationships, causes that had taken on new personal significance. The event would be elegant but accessible, with tickets priced to maximize attendance rather than exclusivity. Everything Victoria's carefully curated social events were not. With every decision, from the diverse catering choices to the community art installations that would replace formal floral arrangements, I felt myself reclaiming pieces of my identity that had been suppressed during my relationship with James. This event would reflect my values, my aesthetic, my vision of community. Meanwhile, whispers reached me through mutual connections that Victoria was planning to attend Frank and Eleanor's vow renewal despite not being invited. "She's insisting it's a misunderstanding," my friend reported. "Says her invitation must have been lost." Eleanor confirmed the rumors with a panicked phone call. "She's telling everyone she's coming. I can't uninvite her without causing a family schism, but her presence will ruin everything." "Let her come," I suggested. "But make sure she knows about my event next door." "Your event?" Eleanor questioned. I explained my plans for the charity luncheon at Orchid Hall, scheduled for the same afternoon as their vow renewal. Eleanor's laughter bubbled through the phone. "That's brilliantly petty." "I love it." "It's not about pettiness," I corrected, though I couldn't deny the element of satisfaction involved. "It's about creating something positive from a painful experience. And perhaps showing Victoria that her approval isn't the metric by which I measure my worth." The day before the events, my anxiety peaked as I considered all the potential complications. What if Victoria made a scene? What if seeing James again reopened wounds I'd thought healed? What if my elaborate gesture came across as bitter rather than empowered? Alex, now solidly in the category of dating exclusively, listened to my concerns over dinner at my apartment. "You're not doing this to hurt anyone," he reminded me. "You're celebrating your freedom and supporting a cause you believe in. Hold on to that intention." His perspective calmed me, as did his offer to help with last-minute preparations the following morning. Unlike James, who had always deferred to his mother's opinions, Alex appeared genuinely impressed by my initiative and organizational skills. On the day itself, I arrived early to oversee final preparations. My Rebecca's New Beginnings charity luncheon banner hung prominently at the entrance plaza, alongside information about the women's organizations benefiting from the event. Volunteers greeted arriving guests warmly, creating an atmosphere of genuine welcome that stood in deliberate contrast to the rigid formality Victoria prized. Alex worked alongside me, hanging art pieces created by women from the shelters, his easy confidence and lack of ego a refreshing change from the Taylor family dynamics I'd become accustomed to. When he squeezed my hand before heading off to park additional chairs, I felt a surge of gratitude for this uncomplicated connection. I was arranging centerpieces when a familiar voice behind me made my spine stiffen. "Rebecca? What are you doing here?" Turning slowly, I faced Victoria Taylor for the first time since canceling the wedding. She looked exactly the same, perfectly coiffed silver hair, tailored pantsuit, expression of perpetual mild disapproval. Behind her stood James, mouth slightly open in surprise. "I'm hosting a charity event," I replied calmly, "for women rebuilding their lives after leaving unhealthy relationships." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "In this venue? Today of all days? That seems rather deliberate." "Actually, it's perfect timing," I said, my smile genuine despite the tension. "Many of Eleanor and Frank's friends are attending both events. They've been wonderfully supportive." The mention of Eleanor and Frank clearly caught Victoria off guard. "You're in contact with my son and daughter-in-law?" "Of course. Their family," I said, emphasizing the last word with quiet satisfaction. "Not by blood or marriage, but through respect and shared values. The things that truly make a family." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line as she absorbed the implicit criticism. Before she could respond, Alex appeared at my side, sliding a supportive arm around my waist. "We're about ready for the opening remarks whenever you are," he said, before extending a hand to Victoria and James. "Alex Rivera. I don't think we've met." The introduction forced Victoria to shift into social pleasantries, though her eyes catalogued Alex with calculated assessment, his confident posture, his simple but well-cut suit, the easy way he stood beside me without dominating the interaction. James stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk privately for a minute?" I hesitated before nodding. "Briefly. My guests will be arriving soon." We stepped into a quiet alcove, leaving Victoria to engage in brittle small talk with Alex. Up close, James looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from maintaining appearances at too high a cost. "You look well," he offered awkwardly. "Really well, actually." "Thank you. I am well." The statement was simple but profound in its truth. He gestured vaguely toward the ballroom where my event was being held. "This is impressive. Mom thinks you're doing it to spite her, but I know better. This is who you always were, someone who builds things, who creates community." The compliment was unexpected, as was the flash of regret that crossed his face. "I should have stood up for you. That day at the caterers, and all the other times before it. I've been seeing a therapist, working on the whole boundaries thing. Too late for us, but I'm trying." For a moment, I glimpsed what might have been if he'd reached this understanding sooner, if we'd found our way through the challenges together rather than fracturing under their weight. But the pain of that lost possibility had dulled to a distant ache, replaced by appreciation for the path I'd found instead. "I'm glad you're doing that work," I said sincerely. "It's important." "Rebecca." Eleanor's voice rang out as she approached, resplendent in a simple sundress for her garden vow renewal. "Everything looks amazing. Half our guests are asking about your luncheon." She embraced me warmly before acknowledging James with a cooler nod. "Victoria's looking for you. Something about the photographer arriving." After he reluctantly departed, Eleanor linked her arm through mine. "Was that weird? Seeing them both?" "Less than I expected," I admitted. "It feels like another lifetime." "That's because it was," she affirmed. "Look at all this. 10 months ago, You were letting Victoria dictate where you could sit at your own wedding. Now you've rented an entire venue and are running a charity event like a boss. That's what I call character development. We laughed together, the sound echoing through the elegant hallway that connected the two venues, one hosting a small, exclusive family gathering from which I had been deliberately excluded, the other filled with a vibrant community I had built myself. My charity luncheon unfolded beautifully, the space filling with diverse attendees united by their commitment to supporting women's independence. Several guests approached to share their own stories of rebuilding after difficult relationships, each expression of gratitude reinforcing that my impulsive decision to host this event had evolved into something genuinely meaningful. Midway through the afternoon, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. From the shared garden area, I could see both venues' sunset gardens where Eleanor and Frank were celebrating their renewal, and Orchid Hall where my event continued in full swing. Two visions of community, both valid, both meaningful in their own ways. From across the entrance plaza, I caught Victoria watching me, her expression a complex mixture of irritation and something that might almost have been respect. I raised my hand in a small wave, not out of spite or triumph, but as acknowledgement of a simple truth. She had been right about one thing. I hadn't been family enough for her standards. I had been something much more valuable, strong enough to walk away, resilient enough to rebuild, and determined enough to create my own definition of family, one founded on mutual respect rather than proximity or tradition. Alex joined me in the garden, his steady presence a reminder of how relationships should feel supportive without being suffocating, caring without being controlling. Your event is a hit, he noted. You've raised twice what you hoped for the shelters. And created some beautiful connections in the process, I added, watching as guests from both events mingled in the shared spaces, conversations flowing freely across what would have once been carefully guarded social boundaries. As we turned to head back inside, I spotted James watching us from the Sunset Gardens patio, his expression thoughtful. He nodded once in my direction in acknowledgement, perhaps even a blessing of sorts. I nodded back, feeling the last threads of what might have been finally released. There was no bitterness now, just appreciation for the lesson learned and the strength discovered. As guests began arriving for my luncheon, I greeted each one by name, no seating chart dictating their value or status. Everyone belonged at the main table. Everyone was family enough.